My name is Jennifer, and this is the story of how I became trapped in a marriage that slowly destroyed my soul as a 39-year-old housewife. While working part-time at a local real estate company, I devoted myself to raising Isabella and managing our household. My marriage to David began 12 years ago, though looking back now, I wish I had seen the warning signs. David was divorced, and Isabella was his daughter from his previous marriage, a detail that would later prove significant in ways I never imagined. I met David at my former workplace, where life seemed simpler and full of promise. Back then, I worked at a construction company, and he would visit as a sales representative, his charm masking what lay beneath. Despite our company's strict policies with contractors, David always maintained a cheerful demeanor and positive attitude that drew me in. Impressed by his apparent sincerity, I recommended his products to my company, not knowing this decision would alter the course of my life. His company won the contract, and he invited me to dinner as a thank you, the beginning of what I thought was a fairy tale. Our relationship deepened, and eventually, he proposed, making me believe I had found my happiness. I joyfully accepted his proposal, ready to start our life together. I even quit my job, believing in the promise of our future. Just before the wedding, David dropped a bombshell: he had a 6-year-old daughter living with him. The revelation left me stunned, but it was true, and there was no turning back. A week before our wedding, I met Isabella for the first time, a shy little girl hiding behind David's legs. In that moment, I made a life-changing decision to live with her and care for her until she graduated high school. Something about those anxious eyes peering from behind David touched my heart in a way I couldn't explain. As this was my first marriage, my family strongly opposed my union with David. My father was particularly furious, warning me that I would become a laughingstock, words that would later prove prophetic. Despite my family's opposition, I followed my heart and married David. Had I listened to my family then, I might have avoided the hell that awaited me. Now, 12 years later, Isabella has turned 18 and is about to graduate high school. What should have been a joyous milestone feels hollow and painful. The promise I made to myself to raise her into a fine adult still weighs heavily on my heart, reminding me of my shattered dreams. I still remember the pain in my heart when Isabella started screaming at me about her shirt. 2 years into our life together, Isabella began calling me a old hag, a cruel nickname that cut deeper than any physical wound. The transformation was gradual, from the sweet child she once was to this cold, distant person who seemed to despise my very existence. When I pulled her freshly laundered shirt from the neatly folded pile of clothes, she demanded to know why I hadn't sent it to the dry cleaners. Her words dripped with contempt as she called me slow and clueless, each syllable another dagger in my heart. I watched helplessly as she stormed away, my shoulders heavy with an invisible burden I couldn't shake. Unable to defend myself, I could only bow my head in silence, a gesture that had become all too familiar. I spent countless nights trying to understand why Isabella had become so harsh towards me, my mind racing with possibilities. At first, I thought it might have been because she was being teased at school about her father's remarriage. That explanation seemed to make sense, but it wasn't the whole story. David's attitude towards me had also changed dramatically over time. The warm smile he once wore during his sales calls had vanished at home, replaced by cold indifference. He started addressing me with crude words like, "Hey, you," and Isabella seemed to follow his lead. I blamed myself, throwing myself into housework and trying even harder to be careful in my interactions with Isabella. Despite my desperate hopes for her to grow into a fine adult, her behavior only worsened with each passing day. Being called old hag became routine, and any words of gratitude from Isabella became nothing but a distant memory. Strangely enough, during parent-teacher conferences, Isabella behaved perfectly normally, showing none of her usual disrespect. David would chat and laugh with Isabella during these times, as if they were in their own little world. The realization that her cruel behavior was reserved solely for me at home cut deeper than any of her harsh words. When I tried to discuss this with David, his cold response was worlds away from the man I had married. With no one to turn to, I carried this dark burden alone, feeling its weight grow heavier with each passing day. The isolation in my own home became more suffocating as time went on, especially after Isabella entered middle school and stopped sharing any news about her school life. I would learn about school events from neighbors, always an outsider looking in. David attended these events alone with Isabella, their shared joy a painful reminder of my exclusion. All I wanted was to be treated as a real family member, to share in their happiness and their lives. I never imagined the pain of having such a simple wish remain forever out of reach. And as time went on, David's treatment of me only grew worse, turning our home into a prison of emotional abuse. David's cruel words became more frequent, attacking my role as a housewife with bitter comments about dust on the stairs and empty toilet paper rolls. His constant criticism of my supposed incompetence and lack of learning ability cut deeper each time. The changes in David were stark, from a man who once shared household chores and believed housewives shouldn't do everything, to someone who dumped all responsibilities on me. Taking care of Isabella had become nothing but a burden, weighing heavily on my shoulders each passing day. Whenever I tried to discuss my struggles with David, he would dismiss me instantly, saying I wasn't trying hard enough. Eventually, everything became my fault, and each conversation left my heart heavier than before. All I could do was apologize and promise to try harder, though my words felt hollow even to myself. David's harsh statement that my efforts were worthless and that I had never succeeded at anything gradually wore away at my soul. As time passed, I felt myself crumbling both mentally and physically under the weight of their constant criticism. When Isabella turned 18, I desperately wanted to know about her post-graduation plans, but she kept me in the dark. David, too, shared nothing with me, maintaining the wall of silence they had built around me. One day, I accidentally overheard Isabella and David discussing her future plans. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but my desperate need to know drew me in. Isabella's voice was filled with joy as she thanked her father for helping her secure both a college recommendation and a scholarship. It was the first time I'd heard such genuine gratitude in her voice, though it wasn't directed at me. My heart shattered as I heard them mockingly refer to me as that dull housewife, while sharing their moment of triumph. I quietly slipped away to the bathroom, my one sanctuary in this house of emotional torture. There, locked away from their cruel laughter, I held my head in my hands and wept silently. In that moment, I questioned the worth of the past decade of my life, wondering what all my endurance had been for. Despite my breaking heart, I had tried so hard to be a mother to Isabella and a wife to David. Even when I felt I couldn't go on, even when my soul screamed in pain, I had kept moving forward. There were mornings I thought I couldn't get out of bed, yet somehow I found the strength to push through another day. But now, hearing them mock everything I had sacrificed for this family, I finally understood the true nature of my situation. Each day, I prepared lunchboxes and breakfast, did the laundry, and handled all the household chores, even though my body ached so much that even lying down brought pain. I had no choice but to keep going, driven by the terrifying fear that if I stopped, they would no longer need me at all. Exhausted beyond measure, I continued this draining routine, though honestly, much of that period remains a blur in my memory. One day, while returning from shopping, my neighbor's casual comment hit me like a thunderbolt when she mentioned the following day's graduation day. Unable to admit I didn't know about it, I could only manage a vague smile before hurrying away. Back home, I collapsed right there in the entryway, my legs no longer able to support me. I had no computer, just a basic phone that could only make calls, leaving me completely isolated from the school community. David controlled all communication with the school, and without any mom friends, I had no way to access school information directly. I'd only learned about sports days and school events by chance, overhearing neighbors' conversations or children's chatter. All I wanted was to properly attend Isabella's high school graduation, to celebrate that precious moment when she would step into adulthood. As I sat crying on the sofa, Isabella returned from school, her words cutting through me like a knife as she called me old hag and demanded to know why I was being lazy and making the house gloomy with my presence. Her eyes blazed with anger as she stared at me, and for the first time, I felt rage rising from deep within my soul. My voice trembled with unconscious accusation as I asked her about her following day's graduation day that no one had bothered to tell me about. Isabella seemed surprised by my words, then her expression turned hostile before she let out an exaggerated sigh. She sneered that there was no point in telling me since I wouldn't be coming anyway. I tilted my head in confusion, telling her I had never said I wouldn't attend. Her response was brutal. She screamed that she didn't want me there, that having an old person like me would only make her a laughingstock on her special day. Her words about being a laughingstock made my head spin as the harsh reality finally sank in. It became crystal clear that she never saw me as family. I was nothing but an embarrassment to her. Any hope I'd held onto for her acceptance was shattered completely by those cruel words. That evening, David came home carrying a suit in a dry cleaning bag, another reminder of my exclusion from this significant family event. David had known about Isabella's graduation all along, yet he sent his suit to the dry cleaners without even mentioning it to me. When I spotted the freshly cleaned suit, David's face twisted into a pitying smile as he mockingly asked if Isabella hadn't told me about it. In that moment, the crushing weight of reality hit me. I was the most dispensable person in this house. All those years of believing I was part of this family had been nothing but a cruel self-deception. Something inside me finally snapped, like a twig that had bent too far for too long. I made my final decision then. My role as a family member would end there and then. The next morning, David and Isabella left for the graduation ceremony without me. David casually mentioned they would eat dinner out, not bothering to include me in their celebration. In the past, I would have silently accepted this treatment. But those days were over. I had reached my breaking point. I had already decided to leave this house, a decision I'd made the previous night while lying awake in my bed. After they left, I quickly packed my belongings and walked out of that house for the last time. I left a single note, expressing my intention to sever family ties and live independently. I added that any further discussions would be handled through my lawyer. Though I hadn't secured legal representation yet, I knew my father would connect me with someone trustworthy. My parents' home was just a 2-hour train ride away, where they lived on their expansive property. My father was a prominent figure in our hometown, owning numerous real estate properties. With his connections, finding a competent lawyer would be straightforward. Another crucial task was selling the house where David and Isabella currently lived. The house stood on land owned by my father, built with funds he had provided as a wedding gift. I had been gradually repaying my father with income from my real estate job. Both the house and land were legally registered under my father's name. David had always assumed the house was an outright gift, never questioning the ownership details. I suspected he never asked about it for fear of angering my father and losing what he thought was his. David was a typical domestic tyrant, strutting around those weaker than him while cowering before anyone with real authority. When I finally told my father everything, tears streamed down my face as I struggled to get the words out between sobs. My father listened intently until the very end, his own eyes glistening with tears that spoke volumes about his understanding. What brought me the most comfort was that he didn't criticize my initial choice to marry David, showing a compassion I hadn't expected. His simple words, telling me how proud he was of my endurance, through it all, touched my heart deeply. After our conversation, my father sprung into action, making several phone calls that brought lawyers and real estate managers to our home. Everything moved with surprising speed, and plans were made to demolish the house in a week's time. I left a note at the house with a simple message: they had to move out within a week. My father couldn't help but comment with dry humor that I was being rather generous with the timeline. For me, it was simply a practical measure to avoid any future complaints or complications. During that week, I had multiple discussions with lawyers about the divorce, and with each meeting, my sense of impending freedom grew stronger. I also shared everything with my mother, our tears mixing as she held me close, her presence providing the comfort I'd been denied for so long. The determination in my mother's face that day is forever etched in my memory. My father and I also discussed plans for my future, mapping out a path forward that felt both scary and liberating. My top priority was establishing a new foundation for my life, one built on my own terms. Opening up to my parents required immense courage and brought its share of pain, but afterward, I felt lighter than I had in years. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in a decade, free from the weight that had pressed upon my chest for so long. A week later, as I was quietly settling into my parents' home, my phone began to ring. It was Isabella calling, her name flashing on the screen like a warning signal. Honestly, I had no desire to speak with her, the mere thought of her voice bringing back waves of painful memories. Dark shadows crept into my heart as I remembered her cruel treatment over the years. But the phone kept ringing persistently, demanding attention I didn't want to give. Then David started calling too, their desperate attempts to reach me becoming more frequent. I suspected they had finally received my note and learned about the impending demolition of the house, their comfortable world crumbling around them. For 10 years, David and Isabella had called me an old hag, exploiting my efforts and treating me as nothing more than a household tool. After enduring such inhumane treatment, the thought of facing them again filled me with dread, my hands trembling at the mere thought. Yet deep down, I knew I couldn't move forward without settling this painful chapter of my life. I felt that inner peace would remain elusive unless I confronted them one final time. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I answered the phone. The moment I picked up, Isabella's harsh voice assaulted my ears, demanding to know where I was. Her voice betrayed both panic and fear, emotions I had never heard from her before. David's voice joined in, telling me I was foolish to leave such a note and ordering me to return home immediately. They were both clearly in a state of distress, their carefully maintained facade crumbling. I could imagine Isabella, fresh from her graduation ceremony, finding her emotional punching bag, her old hag, missing from the house. The note about my departure and divorce must have thrown them into chaos, especially on what should have been her triumphant day. A slight smile crossed my lips as I imagined their shock at finding their comfortable world disrupted. With perfect composure, I asked who was calling, as if I didn't recognize their voices. Isabella was so taken aback by my unexpected response that she stammered, unable to form words. I hung up without another word and contacted the real estate management company. They confirmed the demolition was scheduled to begin the next day. They also informed me that David had already been notified of these plans. I requested a one-day postponement of the demolition and asked them to inform David of the change. This gave them an extra day to visit, exactly as I had planned. I intended to deliver my final blow when they arrived. Their calls continued throughout the day, but I ignored them all. The next day, around noon, the doorbell rang followed by loud knocking. It was David and Isabella, just as I had expected. Though they had clearly wanted to arrive earlier, poor train connections had delayed their journey considerably. They appeared before me, both out of breath from rushing. I had arranged for my parents to stay in another room, making it appear as though I was alone in the house. I showed them into the living room, maintaining my composure. David entered cautiously. His usual domineering presence diminished in this unfamiliar territory. As David entered, I could see him squirming under the invisible weight of my father's reputation, a respected, wealthy figure in this community whose authority clearly intimidated him. Isabella, however, showed no such hesitation, her demeanor suggesting she fully intended to reassert her control and drag me back home. She settled into the living room chair, crossed her legs, and wordlessly gestured for me to sit across from her, every movement radiating the arrogance I'd endured for years. I took my time preparing tea, moving with deliberate slowness before finally taking my seat opposite her. Isabella spoke with obvious irritation, demanding to know what all this meant. David, seated beside her, placed my farewell note on the table between us. I maintained my silence, meeting Isabella's gaze steadily without flinching. She was the first to look away, trying to mask her discomfort with a nervous laugh. She commented on how terrible my act had been yesterday, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. I continued my silent observation, watching as my unchanged expression began to unsettle her. Isabella fidgeted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under my steady gaze. She lashed out, saying it was pointless for an old woman like me to run away, claiming I was nothing but trash without them. I noticed her voice trembling beneath the harsh words and held back my response, recognizing her bravado for what it was. David maintained his silence, watching how events would unfold like a spectator at a theater. Isabella grew more agitated, telling me to stop being stubborn and return home. As her emotional state escalated, I responded with calculated calmness, stating that while I had parents, they were not my family. Isabella's composure cracked visibly as she raised her voice, asking desperately if David and she weren't my family. She turned to David for support, fear of isolation evident in her eyes. David glanced around nervously, and once satisfied my parents weren't present, his demeanor suddenly shifted to aggressive dominance. He agreed with Isabella, declaring that I couldn't survive without them and must return home. His tone became commanding, growing more intimidating now that he believed my father wasn't around. Watching this display, I couldn't help but marvel at how small a man he truly was, his character laid bare in this moment of perceived power. I responded with unwavering resolve that I had no family anymore. A true family would never have treated me as their slave. Family members should support and help each other, especially when someone faces difficulties. But David and Isabella were different. For 10 years, they had treated me like a mere housekeeper, using me as their emotional punching bag. They considered this treatment normal, blind to their own cruelty and mistakes. Their oppression of me had become so unconscious and natural to them that I was amazed I had endured it for a decade. It all began that day when I saw Isabella peering anxiously from behind David, prompting my decision to help raise her into a fine adult. I had endured and served them faithfully, at least until Isabella's high school graduation. I had mentally marked her graduation and college acceptance as the endpoint of our relationship. There had been a tiny flicker of hope that they might change their attitude, but that hope had been thoroughly crushed. Everything had been decided the day before the graduation ceremony, and now I faced them with appropriate detachment. David and Isabella were no longer my family, so there was no need to treat them as such. The moment Isabella realized I was treating them as strangers, her demeanor changed dramatically. She suddenly switched from calling me old hag to a mom, pleading with me to stop this foolishness, realizing her usual tactics weren't working. David watched us both in confusion, clearly unsure how to handle this new dynamic. Isabella's tone transformed from challenging to begging, reminding me that although I wasn't her birth mother, we had lived together for so long. I responded with calculated emotional distance, stating that I had no obligation to grant requests from people who weren't family. Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes as she stared at me. With a look of desperation, finally understanding the consequences of her actions. I watched her composure crumble, years of arrogance giving way to raw fear and uncertainty. Isabella began pleading, asking me to look at her, desperately questioning if the note about selling the house was real, insisting we were family. Every time she used the word family and called me a mom, my skin crawled with revulsion, remembering years of abuse. Her concern seemed focused on losing the house, with my presence appearing merely an afterthought. Despite her desperate pleas, my resolve remained unshaken. Though she hung her head, appearing to cry, I maintained my composure, unmoved by this sudden display of emotion. David, agitated by Isabella's tears, directed his anger at me, demanding to know what the note meant and ordering me to stop the demolition immediately. I calmly replied that it wasn't possible, and my decision was final. He shouted about how I couldn't possibly think this treatment of family would be forgiven. I repeated, with measured patience, that I no longer considered them family. Neither David nor Isabella seemed willing to hear my words, continuing their emotional manipulation. For what felt like the 100th time, I stated clearly that I was not their family. Suddenly, David stood up and slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "Don't mess with me." Though startled, I fought to maintain my composure. My voice came out stronger than intended as I asked who was really playing games here. They had never treated me as family for 10 years, yet suddenly expected me to obey their demands. The anger I'd suppressed for so long was finally bubbling to the surface. Though I maintained a calm exterior, rage boiled deep within me, threatening to explode at any moment. I silently vowed never to back down from them again. David and Isabella seemed oblivious to my anger, still trying to manipulate me as they always had. "I endured your treatment for 10 years, I said, my voice coming out icier than I'd ever heard it before, but I won't endure it anymore. These words, emerging from a decade of suppressed emotions, surprised even me with their coldness. David suddenly stood up and begged me to return home, claiming he was truly sorry. His words fell flat against my hardened heart, carrying no weight after years of abuse. Isabella quickly followed suit, apologizing and pleading with me to forgive her, insisting we were family and should return home together. Her words rang hollow, filled with nothing but self-centered concerns. After treating me like a stranger for 10 years, their sudden appeal to family ties felt like a cruel joke. I couldn't hold back anymore, and asked if they really believed I would return, noting how presumptuous their thinking was. Years of suppressed emotions finally burst forth as I spoke words I had long swallowed for their sake. I told them firmly that I didn't want to hear their excuses, that I could never trust their words again, and that even imagining being family with them once more was repulsive. I placed a single document in front of David, divorce papers already bearing my signature. I instructed him to sign them, stating they would be submitted immediately. David shook his head with a smirk, telling me to think things through carefully. His attitude both shocked and disgusted me, showing his true nature even in this situation. I remembered that first smile he had given me years ago, and felt sick at how shallow and manipulative it had been all along. Rising from my seat, I called for my parents to enter. When my parents appeared in the living room, David and Isabella's jaws dropped in shock. My father fixed David with a piercing stare while my mother's face hardened with disapproval. David physically shrank under their gaze, repeatedly muttering apologies. Then, in a stunning display of audacity, he suddenly declared that everything was my fault. I could hardly believe my ears at his accusation. My father's brow furrowed, but he silently waited for David to continue, allowing him to dig his own grave deeper. David desperately tried to blame me, claiming I had left home on my own accord and he was merely trying to persuade me to return, looking to Isabella for support. But my father's thunderous voice cut through his excuses, shaking the very windows of the house as he demanded to know how David dared blame me for this situation. David and Isabella fell silent, their faces draining of color at my father's commanding presence. My father stood directly in front of David, leaning down to meet his eyes with an intensity that made David shrink back. He questioned David's audacity in calling my actions selfish when David himself had proven to be nothing but self-centered. Then my father turned his stern gaze to Isabella, asking if she had ever considered the extent of pain she and David had inflicted upon me. His voice boomed through the room again, and I could see Isabella trembling. My father wasn't finished. He revealed that he knew about Isabella's troubles at school. Through his investigation, we had discovered that Isabella had been forcibly taking money from other students, victims too frightened to report her actions. My father was already preparing to file criminal charges. Isabella's screams of denial held no remorse, only desperate attempts to escape the situation. Then my father dropped another bombshell, confronting David about his embezzlement at work. The investigation, initially started for my divorce proceedings, had uncovered that David had been stealing company money by fabricating business trips. David's shocked response asking how such an investigation had happened showed no regret, only anger at being caught. My father declared that they both needed to answer not only to me but to the law as well. My mother, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke up with quiet authority, telling them to sign the divorce papers and leave immediately. Through his tears, David kept refusing, but finally, with my father holding out the pen, he had no choice but to sign the papers with trembling hands. I glanced at the clock, noting it was nearly 7 p.m. The last train would depart at 7:30, and in this small town with no taxis, missing it meant being stranded until morning. If they couldn't catch that train, they wouldn't make it back in time for tomorrow's demolition. As I debated whether to inform them of this crucial detail, Isabella suddenly made an astonishing suggestion about demanding child support since I had initiated the divorce. Her words left not only me but my parents speechless, their faces registering shock at her audacity. I responded coldly, telling her that what she had done constituted criminal behavior, comparable to domestic violence. Though momentarily taken aback, Isabella quickly regained her defiant attitude, demanding to see proof. I placed a single notebook on the table, explaining it was the diary I had kept since our marriage began. Isabella looked at me with contempt, mockingly asking what kind of evidence someone without a smartphone or computer could possibly have. I calmly informed her that diaries were valid evidence, that proof wasn't limited to photos, audio, or video recordings. The smug expression vanished from Isabella's face as realization dawned. I confirmed that my lawyer had already accepted the diary as crucial evidence. David and Isabella finally fell silent, their heads bowed in defeat. Looking at the clock again, I remarked with quiet satisfaction that they had missed life's last train and wouldn't be able to return home tonight. My mother, wearing a knowing smile, pointed out the lack of taxis and decent hotels in the area. She then firmly told them the discussion was over and to leave immediately. From the second-floor balcony, I watched them running desperately toward the station. They clearly hadn't believed the last train would depart so early. As I observed their panicked figures growing smaller in the distance, I felt the heavy burden I'd carried for so long gradually lifting from my shoulders. Though some issues remained unresolved, I sensed a chapter of my life had finally closed. Later, I learned they had failed to find a taxi and had to walk for an hour before finding a hotel. When David and Isabella returned home the next day, demolition had already begun, leaving them only enough time to salvage their clothes. What they didn't know was that I had already safely stored all the furniture, appliances, and my personal belongings in a warehouse. Later, my lawyer contacted me to confirm that the divorce had been finalized, including the settlement for damages. The private investigator's report revealed that David had been fired for embezzlement, while Isabella had been expelled from high school due to her scandalous behavior, destroying her chances of attending college. David, now jobless, could barely afford a small, run-down apartment far from the station. He and Isabella, who had dropped out of high school, were living there together. According to reports, Isabella blamed everything on David, constantly criticizing him, leading to endless arguments between them. As I contemplated my next step after quitting my part-time real estate job, my father suggested I join the family business. I decided to work at his property management company, in a tourist area. The change from city life to a tourist town brought a refreshing new perspective to my life. Being surrounded by nature became my healing sanctuary. I also made the decision to adopt a dog. This dog has become my only family now. Moving forward, I plan to enjoy a peaceful life with just my dog by my side, finding contentment in our simple companionship.